He thought handing her a broken piano would humiliate her in seconds, but he had no idea he was about to destroy his own reputation in front of everyone. The golden lights of the theater reflected off polished wood floors as guests in tailored suits sipped wine and whispered, their laughter sharp when Clara Whitman stepped forward in her plain gray dress, invisible just moments ago, until someone smirked and said, "Let her try the broken one." A few chuckles. A phone lifted to record. This should be good. The piano sat there like a trap, keys uneven, strings slightly off, designed to fail anyone foolish enough to touch it. Clara didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply sat down. For a second, the room buzzed louder. Then, her fingers moved. Not hesitant. Not unsure. Precise. Controlled. The first note rang out, imperfect, but intentional. Then another. And another. She wasn't fighting the broken piano, she was using it. The melody twisted around its flaws, turning cracks into character, mistakes into music. The laughter died mid-breath. Glasses froze mid-air. The room went silent. And in that silence, one truth began to settle in: who exactly had they just tried to humiliate? He thought a broken piano would expose her, but he had no idea it would expose him instead. The theater glowed under warm amber lights, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, the kind of place where reputation mattered more than truth and appearance was everything. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses filled the room, their voices blending into a low hum of polite conversation, each one carrying the quiet arrogance of belonging. And then there was Clara Whitman. Standing near the edge of the stage, almost blending into the shadows, dressed in a simple gray cardigan and modest flats, she looked like she had wandered into the wrong world. No one noticed her at first. Or rather, they chose not to. To them, she was part of the background, like the velvet curtains or the silent staff moving between tables. But Clara noticed everything. The subtle glances. The quiet smirks. The way conversations paused just slightly when she stepped too close. She had seen that look before. The kind that measured a person's worth in seconds and decided they weren't enough. Across the room, a group of performers gathered near the grand piano, their laughter sharper, louder, fueled by confidence and attention. One of them, a well-known pianist named Daniel Harper, leaned casually against the instrument, swirling a glass of wine as he spoke. "Tonight's all about precision," he said, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. "You either belong on that stage, or you don't." A few heads nodded. A few quiet laughs followed. Then his eyes drifted, landing on Clara. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of curiosity, but it quickly shifted into something else. Amusement. "Hey," he called out, tilting his head slightly, drawing attention toward her. "You work here, right?" The room's energy shifted almost instantly. Conversation slowed. A few guests turned. Clara paused, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. "I help around here," she replied softly, her voice calm, steady. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect," he said, glancing toward the side of the stage where an old upright piano sat, slightly out of place among the polished instruments. Its wood was worn, a few keys visibly uneven, its presence more decorative than functional. "We've got a little problem with that one," he continued. "It's been out of tune for years. Practically unplayable." A few chuckles rippled through the group. Someone lifted their phone, already sensing entertainment. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink before speaking again. "Why don't you give it a try?" he said lightly. "You know, just for fun." The words hung in the air. Not an invitation. A setup. The kind designed to look harmless while everyone understood exactly what it meant. Clara's eyes moved toward the piano. For a brief second, something flickered across her face. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something quieter. Deeper. The room leaned in without realizing it. A woman near the front whispered, "This should be interesting." Another voice followed, softer but sharper, "She won't even get a proper note out of that thing." Daniel stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the piano like he was offering her a stage. "Go ahead," he said. "Let's hear what you've got." The spotlight above cast a faint glow over the instrument, highlighting every imperfection, every flaw waiting to betray whoever dared to sit down. Clara didn't respond right away. She simply walked forward. Each step echoed softly against the floor, the sound cutting through the quiet that had settled over the room. No one laughed now. Not out loud. They were waiting. Watching. Phones raised. Eyes locked. Expecting failure. Expecting confirmation of what they already believed. She reached the piano and paused. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, not touching them yet. The silence stretched. Even Daniel's confident smile tightened just slightly, as if something about her stillness felt unfamiliar. Then Clara slowly took a seat. Her posture straightened, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the room. In her. The noise faded. The judgment disappeared. The years between who she had been and who she appeared to be, collapsed into a single breath. Her fingers lowered. The first key pressed down. A note rang out. Imperfect. Slightly off. Exactly as expected. A few smirks returned. A quiet exhale of amusement moved through the crowd. But Clara didn't stop. Her fingers moved again. And this time, there was something different. Subtle. Controlled. Intentional. The second note followed. Then the third. And somewhere between those broken sounds, a pattern began to form. The room didn't realize it yet. But the joke was already over. The sound should have been wrong. That was what everyone expected. The uneven keys, the slightly warped strings, the tired wood that had not been tuned in years, it should have produced nothing but noise. And at first, it almost did. The early notes wavered, fragile and imperfect, echoing faintly across the room. A man near the back let out a quiet chuckle, quickly covering it with a sip of his drink. Someone else shifted, already losing interest, convinced the outcome was exactly what they predicted. But Clara did not react to any of it. Her gaze remained steady on the keys, her fingers adjusting ever so slightly, testing, learning, mapping the instrument in real time. It was subtle, almost invisible, but something in her touch began to change. She was not fighting the piano anymore. She was listening to it. The fourth note came softer, placed with intention rather than force. The fifth followed, aligning with the imperfection instead of resisting it. And then, almost without warning, the scattered sounds began to connect. Not perfectly. Not traditionally. But undeniably. A melody started to emerge, weaving itself carefully through the flaws of the instrument like light slipping through cracked glass. The room did not notice immediately. It happened too gradually, too quietly. But the laughter stopped. One by one, conversations faded, replaced by a growing stillness that no one could quite explain. Daniel Harper felt it before he understood it. His smile, once relaxed and confident, held for a second too long before tightening at the edges. He shifted his weight slightly, his glass lowering just a fraction as his attention sharpened. This was not supposed to happen. Clara's hands moved with increasing confidence now, not faster, but more precise, as if every broken key had revealed its secret to her. She adjusted her pressure, her timing, even her pauses, transforming each flawed sound into something deliberate. What had been a weakness moments ago was becoming texture. Depth. Emotion. A woman near the front leaned forward unconsciously, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand what she was hearing. "Wait," she whispered, barely audible, "is that?" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The music answered for her. It was not just a melody now. It was a story. One shaped by restraint, by control, by a mastery that did not need perfection to exist. Clara's expression never changed. Calm. Focused. Detached from the room that had tried to define her just minutes earlier. For her, the audience no longer existed. There was only the instrument, flawed and honest, and the music she was pulling from it. The chandeliers above seemed to dim in presence, the golden light settling into the background as every ear in the room turned toward the stage. Even the faint clink of glass had disappeared. No one dared interrupt the moment. Daniel swallowed slowly, his throat suddenly dry. He glanced around, expecting someone else to laugh, to break the tension, to restore the balance he had created. But no one did. They were all watching. Listening. Realizing. The same phones that had been raised to capture embarrassment were now frozen, their owners unsure whether to record or simply witness. A man in the corner lowered his device entirely, his expression shifting from amusement to something closer to disbelief. Clara's fingers moved across the keys with a quiet authority, her rhythm steady, her control undeniable. Each note, though imperfect on its own, became part of something larger, something undeniably beautiful when heard together. And that was when it happened. The realization. Not loud. Not dramatic. But heavy. It settled into the room like a weight pressing down on every assumption that had been made. This was not luck. This was not improvisation born from desperation. This was skill. Refined. Intentional. Unmistakable. Daniel's jaw tightened as the truth began to form, unwelcome and undeniable. He had not given her an impossible task. He had handed her a stage. And now, he could not take it back. The final sequence approached, though no one could say exactly how they knew. The music carried a sense of direction, of purpose, as if it had always been meant to reach this moment. Clara's hands slowed slightly, drawing the room in even closer, every breath held, every eye fixed. And in that suspended silence, just before the next note would fall, one question lingered unspoken in every mind in the room: who exactly had they been laughing at all this time? The final note did not arrive with force. It arrived with certainty. Clara let it settle into the room, her fingers resting lightly on the keys as the last vibration of sound faded into the high ceiling above. For a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full, heavy with realization, with the quiet collapse of assumptions that had seemed so certain just minutes ago. A glass somewhere in the back was set down too carefully, the faint click echoing louder than it should have. Clara did not look up right away. She remained still, composed, as if the performance had not been meant for them at all. As if it had simply needed to exist. Then slowly, she lifted her hands from the piano. The broken instrument that had been meant to expose her now sat transformed, no longer a prop for ridicule, but proof of something far greater than anyone in that room had anticipated. Daniel Harper stood frozen, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something he was not yet ready to name. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a tightening around his eyes, a stiffness in his posture that betrayed the shift happening inside him. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, but no words came. What could he say that would not reveal the truth already written across the faces around him? A woman near the front finally exhaled, her breath shaky, as if she had been holding it for far too long. That was, she began, but stopped, unable to finish the thought. There were no simple words left for what they had just witnessed. The phones that had been raised for mockery slowly lowered, forgotten in hands that now felt uncertain, almost embarrassed. One man glanced at his screen, then quickly locked it, as if erasing what he had intended to capture could undo the moment entirely. Clara stood from the bench with the same quiet grace she had carried when she first approached the stage. No flourish. No acknowledgement. She did not wait for applause, and none came at first, not because it was undeserved, but because the room had not yet caught up to what had happened. Applause required certainty. And certainty had just been taken from them. Daniel finally took a step forward, the movement hesitant, unfamiliar. He looked at the piano, then at Clara, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the two. He started, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. He cleared his throat, attempting to recover some version of control. I did not expect, again, the sentence failed him. Because expectation had been the problem all along. Clara met his gaze briefly. Her eyes were steady, not confrontational, not forgiving, simply present. She did not need to respond. The answer was already in the silence surrounding them. Across the room, the shift became undeniable. People straightened, their expressions more careful now, more aware. The invisible line that had once separated Clara from them had dissolved, leaving behind something far more uncomfortable. Equality. Respect, uninvited but undeniable. A man who had laughed earlier now avoided looking in her direction entirely. Another adjusted his jacket, as if trying to regain a sense of composure that had quietly slipped away. The energy of the room had changed, not with noise, but with understanding. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just slightly. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Not about her. About himself. He glanced around, noticing the eyes on him now, the unspoken questions forming, the subtle shift of attention that no longer favored him. The stage he had offered as a joke had become something else entirely. And he was no longer at its center. Clara turned slightly, her attention moving away from him, away from the crowd, as if the moment had already passed for her. As if she had never needed their approval in the first place. She took a step back from the piano, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor breaking the silence in the smallest possible way. And yet, it echoed. Because now, every movement mattered. Every gesture carried weight. No one stopped her. No one spoke. They simply watched. Not with curiosity. Not with amusement. But with something far quieter. Recognition. And as Clara began to walk away from the stage, leaving behind the instrument, the room, and the people who had misjudged her, one thought lingered in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If this was what she could do with something broken, then what had she truly been capable of all along? Clara had almost reached the edge of the stage when a sound finally broke through the silence behind her. It was not loud, not confident, but unmistakable. A single clap. It came from somewhere near the center of the room, hesitant at first, as if the person delivering it was unsure whether they had the right to do so. Then another followed. And another. Within seconds, the hesitation began to dissolve, replaced by something stronger, something more certain. The applause spread, not in a sudden burst, but in a rising wave, building from scattered acknowledgement into a unified recognition that could no longer be held back. The room that had once watched her with quiet amusement now stood, one by one, as if compelled by something deeper than social expectation. Clara paused, her hand lightly resting against the curtain at the side of the stage. She did not turn immediately. She did not react the way they expected. The applause grew louder, fuller, echoing off the high ceilings, filling the space with a sound that felt entirely different from the laughter that had filled it before. This was not entertainment. This was respect trying to find its voice. Slowly, Clara turned back. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, but her eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces that had shifted so completely in such a short time. The same people who had doubted her now stood in acknowledgement, their applause carrying something heavier than admiration. It carried realization. Daniel Harper did not clap at first. He stood still, his hands at his sides, watching her with an intensity that had replaced his earlier confidence entirely. The sound around him seemed distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the quiet confrontation happening within him. He had built his reputation on precision, on control, on the ability to judge talent within seconds. And yet, in one moment, in one performance, that certainty had been dismantled. He finally lifted his hands, bringing them together in a slow, deliberate motion. Not for the room. Not for appearance. But because there was no other honest response left. Clara acknowledged the applause with the smallest inclination of her head, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, yet it carried more grace than any dramatic bow. She did not step forward to claim the stage. She did not speak. She simply accepted the moment for what it was and nothing more. As the applause continued, a man near the front stepped closer to the piano, his gaze fixed on the instrument as if trying to understand what had just happened. He pressed one of the uneven keys lightly. The note that came out was flat, dull, undeniably flawed. He pressed another, then another, each confirming what everyone already knew. The piano had not changed. It was still broken. He stepped back slowly, his expression shifting into quiet disbelief. The realization spread quickly through those close enough to witness it. This had never been about the instrument. It had never been about the conditions. It had been about her. Daniel noticed the same thing, his eyes moving from the man at the piano back to Clara. For a brief moment, something like humility crossed his face, unfamiliar but undeniable. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, not with authority this time, but with caution. "Clara," he said, her name sounding different now, stripped of assumption, carrying weight. She stopped, turning slightly to face him again. The room, though still filled with applause, seemed to quiet in anticipation of what would follow. Daniel hesitated, searching for words that did not come easily. "I misjudged you," he said finally, the sentence simple, but heavier than anything he had said that evening. Clara held his gaze, her expression steady. There was no triumph in her eyes. No satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding that required no explanation. She did not respond right away, and in that pause, the truth settled even deeper. Some things did not need to be answered. Some lessons spoke for themselves. Around them, the applause began to soften, not fading completely, but settling into something more reflective, more aware. The room had changed, not just in how it saw Clara, but in how it saw itself. The assumptions that once felt invisible were now impossible to ignore. Clara gave a small nod, not of acceptance, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. Then she turned once more and stepped off the stage, disappearing behind the curtain without another word. The applause lingered for a few seconds longer before slowly dissolving into silence again. But this silence was different. It was no longer filled with judgment. It was filled with thought. Daniel remained where he stood, his eyes still fixed on the empty space where Clara had been. For the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about performance or reputation. He was thinking about something far more unsettling. How many times had he dismissed someone before ever giving them a chance? And how many times had he been wrong? The room did not return to what it had been. Conversations resumed, but softer now, more careful. The confidence that once filled the space had been replaced by something quieter. Awareness. And somewhere beyond the stage, beyond the curtain, Clara continued walking, unchanged, untouched by the opinions that had shifted so dramatically behind her. Because for her, nothing had been proven tonight. Only revealed. And not just about her. But about everyone who had watched. The hallway behind the stage was quiet, almost untouched by the shift that had just taken place beyond the curtain. The applause had faded, replaced by distant murmurs that no longer carried the same confidence as before. Clara walked steadily along the narrow corridor, the soft hum of overhead lights guiding her path. Her steps were unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. To her, it had not been a performance. It had been a moment. And moments, she had learned long ago, did not define who you were. They only revealed it. A stagehand near the corner glanced up as she passed, his eyes lingering a second longer than they would have earlier that evening. There was no confusion in his expression now. Only quiet respect. He gave a small nod, almost instinctive, and Clara returned it with the same simplicity before continuing on. Behind her, the theater struggled to return to its rhythm. Conversations resumed, but something had shifted in the tone. The laughter was softer, less certain. Words were chosen more carefully, as if everyone had suddenly become aware of how easily they could be wrong. Daniel Harper remained near the stage, his attention drifting between the piano and the empty space Clara had left behind. The instrument still sat there, unchanged, its worn keys a silent reminder of what had just occurred. He walked toward it slowly, his footsteps measured, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. When he reached the bench, he did not sit. He simply stood there, looking down at the keys. He pressed one lightly. The sound was flat, hollow, exactly as it had been before. He pressed another, then stopped, his hand hovering just above the surface. The truth was undeniable. Nothing about the piano had changed. Which meant everything had been about her. A quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "You gave her that, did you not?" Daniel turned slightly to see an older man standing a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. There was no accusation in his tone, only observation. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I thought it would be amusing," he admitted, the word sounding weaker now than it had in his mind earlier. The man studied him for a moment before nodding once. "It was," he said calmly. "Just not in the way you expected." Daniel gave a faint, almost humorless smile. He could not argue with that. Across the room, small groups had formed, their conversations circling back to the same moment again and again. "Did you hear how she adjusted the timing?" one woman asked quietly. "That was not luck," another replied. "That was control." Near the back, a younger musician shook his head slowly. "I have trained for years," he said, almost to himself. "I would not have known where to begin with that instrument." The word spread, not loudly, but steadily, each observation reinforcing the same conclusion. Clara Whitman was not who they had assumed she was. And more importantly, she had never needed to prove it. Back in the hallway, Clara reached a small door marked staff only. She paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle. For a moment, the quiet around her deepened, offering a space untouched by judgment or expectation. She closed her eyes. Just for a second, not in exhaustion, but in reflection. Then she opened the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was simple, functional, far removed from the elegance of the theater. A small table, a chair, a coat hanging neatly on a hook. Clara moved toward it, slipping on her coat with the same calm precision she had shown at the piano. Her reflection caught briefly in a small mirror on the wall. There was no transformation there. No visible sign of what had just unfolded. Just the same woman who had walked in earlier that evening. And yet, everything around her had changed. Back on the stage, Daniel finally stepped away from the piano, his gaze lingering for one last moment before turning toward the audience. The room felt different now, not smaller, but quieter in a way that demanded awareness. He straightened his jacket slightly, but the gesture lacked its usual confidence. Because confidence built on assumption had a way of fading once exposed. As he moved through the crowd, a few people glanced at him, their expressions respectful, but no longer unquestioning. That shift, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed. He had always been the one defining the moment. Tonight, he had been part of the lesson. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying a calm that the theater could not hold on to. Clara stepped out onto the sidewalk, the distant glow of streetlights stretching along the quiet road. She paused for a moment, looking ahead, not back. Whatever had happened inside no longer belonged to her. It belonged to those who needed to understand it. She adjusted her coat slightly and began to walk, her step steady, her presence once again blending into the world around her. And somewhere behind her, inside a room filled with polished surfaces and carefully constructed identities, a simple truth lingered long after she had gone. Respect was never something you demanded. It was something you revealed. And once revealed, it could never be unseen. The city did not change for Clara Whitman, but something inside it had shifted for those who had seen her. Morning came quietly, sunlight stretching across the streets, touching storefront windows and polished glass towers, bringing with it the same rhythm that had always existed. People hurried past one another, coffee cups in hand, conversations blending into the familiar noise of a new day. And somewhere within that rhythm, the memory of the night before lingered, subtle but persistent, like a note that refused to fade completely. Inside the theater, the staff moved through their routines with an unusual sense of awareness. The same stage that had hosted laughter now held a different kind of silence, one that carried weight even in the absence of an audience. The broken piano remained where it had been left, untouched, its worn keys no longer overlooked but quietly acknowledged. A technician stood near it, inspecting the instrument with a level of attention it had not received in years. He pressed a few keys, listening carefully, then stepped back with a small shake of his head, as if confirming something he already knew. It had not been fixed. It had not been improved. Which meant what they had witnessed could not be explained away. Daniel Harper arrived earlier than usual that morning. His steps were slower, more deliberate as he entered the empty theater, the quiet space amplifying the thoughts he had not been able to silence overnight. He walked directly toward the stage, his eyes drawn once again to the piano. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at it, as if expecting it to reveal something more. But it did not. It remained exactly what it had always been. The difference was no longer in the object. It was in him. He moved closer, lowering himself onto the bench this time. His fingers hovered above the keys, hesitant, as if unsure whether he had the right to touch them. Then, slowly, he pressed one. The sound was imperfect, just as before. He tried another, adjusting his pressure, his timing, attempting to recreate even a fraction of what Clara had done. But the notes refused to cooperate. They remained fragmented, disconnected, lacking the cohesion he had witnessed so clearly the night before. Daniel stopped, his hands resting still on his lap. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar in this space. Not frustration. Not disappointment. But humility. Because he understood now that what he had seen was not something that could be imitated on command. It was something earned through experience he could not see. Behind him, a quiet voice spoke. You will not find it that way. Daniel turned to see the older man from the night before standing near the edge of the stage, his expression calm, almost knowing. Daniel exhaled softly. I thought I might understand it if I tried, he admitted. The man stepped closer, his gaze shifting briefly to the piano before returning to Daniel. Understanding does not come from repetition, he said. It comes from perspective. Daniel absorbed the words, his eyes lowering slightly as the meaning settled in. He nodded once, slowly, then stood from the bench. The room remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt reflective. Outside, Clara moved through her day as she always had. A small grocery store. A quiet street. The simple routines that did not demand recognition. A cashier greeted her with a polite smile, unaware of anything beyond the moment in front of them. And Clara returned the smile just the same. Because that was who she was. Not defined by a single moment, but consistent in every one that followed. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, a faint melody drifted through her mind, not from memory, but from instinct. The same calm, controlled rhythm that had guided her hands the night before. She did not dwell on it. She did not revisit the stage in her thoughts. Because she did not need to. What had happened had already served its purpose. Back at the theater, Daniel stood near the entrance, watching as the staff continued their work. The conversations were quieter now, more thoughtful, as if everyone had been given something they were still trying to process. He adjusted his jacket slightly, the movement more habit than intention. But this time, it did not carry the same meaning. Because something had shifted beneath it. Something deeper than appearance. He glanced once more toward the stage, toward the piano that had unknowingly become the center of a lesson no one had expected. And in that quiet moment, one truth settled into place with a clarity he could not ignore. Talent did not announce itself. It revealed itself when given the chance. And sometimes, the greatest mistake was believing you already knew who deserved that chance. The days that followed did not announce themselves with change, but the change was there, quietly settling into the spaces where certainty once lived. At the theater, conversations no longer carried the same careless confidence. People still spoke, still laughed, still moved through their routines, but there was a pause. Now, a subtle hesitation before judgment, as if everyone had become aware of something they could no longer ignore. The broken piano was no longer ignored in the corner of the stage. It had become a point of quiet reflection. Some passed by it without stopping, but their eyes lingered longer than before. Others approached it, pressing a key or two, as if hoping to understand what had happened that night. But the result was always the same. Imperfect notes. Unremarkable sound. The mystery remained untouched. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of the stage once again, watching as a small group gathered near the instrument. One of the younger performers attempted to play a simple melody, adjusting his touch, his timing, even shifting his posture in an effort to replicate what he had witnessed. But the music never formed. It broke apart almost immediately, falling back into the same flawed pattern the piano had always produced. The performer stepped back, shaking his head slightly, his expression caught between frustration and quiet admiration. "I do not understand how she did it," he said under his breath. Daniel did not respond right away. He watched the failed attempt with a calm that would have seemed unusual just days before. "You are trying to fix the piano," he said finally. The young performer looked at him, confused. Daniel's gaze remained steady. "She did not fix it," he continued. "She accepted it." The words hung in the air, simple, but layered with meaning that extended far beyond the instrument itself. The group fell silent, each person considering what that might mean. Across the room, the older man who had spoken to Daniel before observed quietly, his expression unchanged, as if he had expected this realization to arrive in its own time. Later that afternoon, a meeting was called among the theater's leadership. It was not unusual for them to gather, but the tone of this one was different. There was less certainty in the room, more listening, more consideration. Daniel sat at the table, his posture composed, but his presence no longer carried the same unquestioned authority. When he spoke, it was measured, deliberate, as if each word had been weighed before being allowed to exist. "We need to reconsider how we evaluate people," he said, his voice calm but firm. A few exchanged glances, surprised by the shift. One of the directors leaned forward slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Daniel paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of care. "I am suggesting that we have been wrong before," he replied. The room grew quiet. No one challenged him. Because they had all seen it. They had all been there. Outside, Clara continued her life without interruption. The same grocery store. The same quiet streets. The same simple routines that did not demand recognition. But something had changed, even if only slightly. A man held the door open for her a second longer than necessary. A woman at the checkout counter smiled with a little more warmth. Small gestures. Subtle shifts. Not because they knew what she had done, but because the world, in its quiet way, had begun to adjust. Clara noticed, but she did not dwell on it. She accepted it the same way she accepted everything else. Without expectation. Without attachment. Because she understood something that most people did not. Respect that came from others was temporary. But self-respect was constant. And that was enough. Back at the theater, Daniel stood alone once more, the stage empty, the seats unoccupied. The quiet stretched across the room, uninterrupted, allowing him space to think without distraction. His eyes moved slowly across the space, taking in the details he had once overlooked. The worn edges of the stage. The subtle imperfections in the floor. The way light settled unevenly across the room. None of it had changed. But his awareness of it had. He stepped toward the piano, stopping just short of the bench this time. He did not sit. He did not reach for the keys. Instead, he simply looked at it, understanding now that the lesson it had delivered did not require repetition. It required memory. And as he stood there, in the quiet space where certainty had once defined him, one realization settled into place with a clarity he could not ignore. The greatest limitation had never been the instrument. It had been the assumption of who was worthy to play it. And once that assumption was broken, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. The theater eventually returned to its schedule, performances continuing, lights rising and falling on cue, audiences filling seats with the same anticipation they always had. But something subtle remained, woven into the atmosphere like a quiet echo that refused to disappear. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the way people now looked twice instead of once, in the hesitation before a judgment was spoken out loud. The broken piano was moved from its corner, not discarded, not repaired, but placed deliberately at the center of a smaller rehearsal room. Not as decoration, but as a reminder. Those who entered that room often found themselves drawn to it, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, something they could not easily explain. Some tried to play it, pressing keys carefully, experimenting with pressure and rhythm, hoping to unlock what had once seemed impossible. But the result was always the same. The instrument remained unchanged. And slowly, they began to understand that it was never meant to be changed. It was meant to change them. Daniel Harper no longer stood at the center of every room he entered. His presence was still respected, his skill still acknowledged, but there was a difference now, something quieter, more grounded. He listened more. Observed more. And when he spoke, it was no longer to define others, but to understand them. One afternoon, during a small rehearsal, a young woman stood nervously near the stage, her hands clasped together, her posture uncertain. She had been invited to audition, but the weight of the room pressed against her confidence, threatening to silence her before she even began. Daniel noticed her hesitation. For a brief moment, the memory of another night flickered through his mind, not as regret, but as clarity. He stepped forward, his voice calm, measured. "Take your time," he said. "The stage is not here to judge you." The words were simple, but they carried something different now. Something earned. The young woman looked at him, surprised, then nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to allow her to breathe. Across the city, Clara Whitman continued her life as she always had. The world around her remained largely unaware of what had taken place, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She moved through her routines with the same quiet consistency, her presence steady, her purpose unchanged. But sometimes, in the stillness of early morning or the calm of a quiet evening, she would sit at an old piano in a modest room, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Not performing. Not proving. Simply playing. The music that filled those moments was not shaped by expectation or observation. It was shaped by something far more personal. Something that did not require an audience to exist. Back at the theater, the older man who had watched everything unfold stood once more near the edge of the stage, his gaze steady as he observed the subtle transformations taking place. He had seen many performances in his lifetime, many moments of brilliance that came and went like passing light. But this had been different. Because it had not only revealed talent. It had revealed truth. And truth, once seen, had a way of changing everything it touched. One evening, long after the audience had left and the lights had dimmed, Daniel found himself alone in the rehearsal room where the broken piano now stood. The silence was complete, uninterrupted, allowing every thought to settle without resistance. He approached the instrument slowly, stopping just a few inches away. For a moment, he considered sitting down, letting his hands fall onto the keys, attempting once more to understand what could not be recreated. But he did not. Instead, he remained standing, his reflection faintly visible in the worn surface of the piano. He had spent years believing that mastery came from control, from precision, from the ability to shape outcomes according to expectation. But now, he understood something far more important. Mastery also required humility. The kind that allowed you to see beyond appearances. The kind that reminded you that brilliance did not always arrive in the form you expected. He let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the piano untouched. Because the lesson it carried was no longer something he needed to test. It was something he needed to remember. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet room far removed from stages and audiences, Clara's fingers moved gently across familiar keys, the melody soft, unhurried, existing only for the moment itself. No applause. No expectation. Just music. And in that quiet, unseen space, the truth remained exactly as it had always been. The world does not always recognize brilliance when it first appears. But that does not diminish its value. It only reveals who was willing to see it. The theater eventually returned to its schedule, performances continuing, lights rising and falling on cue, audiences filling seats. With the same anticipation they always had. But something subtle remained, woven into the atmosphere like a quiet echo that refused to disappear. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the way people now looked twice instead of once, in the hesitation before a judgment was spoken out loud. The broken piano was moved from its corner, not discarded, not repaired, but placed deliberately at the center of a smaller rehearsal room. Not as decoration, but as a reminder. Those who entered that room often found themselves drawn to it, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, something they could not easily explain. Some tried to play it, pressing keys carefully, experimenting with pressure and rhythm, hoping to unlock what had once seemed impossible. But the result was always the same. The instrument remained unchanged. And slowly, they began to understand that it was never meant to be changed. It was meant to change them. Daniel Harper no longer stood at the center of every room he entered. His presence was still respected, his skill still acknowledged, but there was a difference now, something quieter, more grounded. He listened more. Observed more. And when he spoke, it was no longer to define others, but to understand them. One afternoon, during a small rehearsal, a young woman stood nervously near the stage, her hands clasped together, her posture uncertain. She had been invited to audition, but the weight of the room pressed against her confidence, threatening to silence her before she even began. Daniel noticed her hesitation. For a brief moment, the memory of another night flickered through his mind, not as regret, but as clarity. He stepped forward, his voice calm, measured. "Take your time," he said. "The stage is not here to judge you." The words were simple, but they carried something different now. Something earned. The young woman looked at him, surprised, then nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to allow her to breathe. Across the city, Clara Whitman continued her life as she always had. The world around her remained largely unaware of what had taken place, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She moved through her routines with the same quiet consistency, her presence steady, her purpose unchanged. But sometimes, in the stillness of early morning or the calm of a quiet evening, she would sit at an old piano in a modest room, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Not performing. Not proving. Simply playing. The music that filled those moments was not shaped by expectation or observation. It was shaped by something far more personal. Something that did not require an audience to exist. Back at the theater, the older man who had watched everything unfold stood once more near the edge of the stage, his gaze steady as he observed the subtle transformations taking place. He had seen many performances in his lifetime, many moments of brilliance that came and went like passing light. But this had been different. Because it had not only revealed talent. It had revealed truth. And truth, once seen, had a way of changing everything it touched. One evening, long after the audience had left and the lights had dimmed, Daniel found himself alone in the rehearsal room where the broken piano now stood. The silence was complete, uninterrupted, allowing every thought to settle without resistance. He approached the instrument slowly, stopping just a few inches away. For a moment, he considered sitting down, letting his hands fall onto the keys, attempting once more to understand what could not be recreated. But he did not. Instead, he remained standing, his reflection faintly visible in the worn surface of the piano. He had spent years believing that mastery came from control, from precision, from the ability to shape outcomes according to expectation. But now, he understood something far more important. Mastery also required humility. The kind that allowed you to see beyond appearances. The kind that reminded you that brilliance did not always arrive in the form you expected. He let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the piano untouched. Because the lesson it carried was no longer something he needed to test. It was something he needed to remember. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet room far removed from stages and audiences, Clara's fingers moved gently across familiar keys, the melody soft, unhurried, existing only for the moment itself. No applause. No expectation. Just music. And in that quiet, unseen space, the truth remained exactly as it had always been. The world does not always recognize brilliance when it first appears. But that does not diminish its value. It only reveals who was willing to see it.